Okay, so I lived in this beautiful seminary for a year where I studied liberation theology. Then I moved to the South Bronx, where I was influenced by the readings of Martin Luther King Jr. and my experiences with Mother Teresa. And now it was time to send me internationally so I could experience what it was like to work in and live in other countries. So the first place they sent me to was the Middle East. I went to Egypt actually to study Arabic at the American University in Cairo. But what I experienced there was wild and beyond my belief. I never saw such things or saw people had so many different experiences. It was a fascinating time for me. But one of the things that was fascinating is I met Islam for the first time and the Catholic Coptic Christian Church, which I had never even known anything about. But I was still looking for words of wisdom from this culture. And I didn't find it from religion, but I found it from the wisdom of the pharaohs that had developed this ancient culture. They said by living a life based on wisdom and truth, one can discover the divinity of the soul, its union to the universe, and the supreme peace and contentment which comes from satisfying the inner drive for self-discovery. Well, the inner drive for self discovery resonated with me completely. So I finished my year of Arabic language studies, and then I was being sent to North Yemen, where I was going to be a teacher in a school there. When I arrived in Yemen, I was fascinated. It was like nothing I'd ever seen in my whole life. It was like going back into the 7th century. It was amazing and fascinating. I loved the people, I loved the language, which was so unusual, and I really enjoyed just being in the marketplaces and watching what was going on. Now, although I was there enjoying myself a lot, I actually was there supposedly teaching people. We were teaching students. And here's the group of teachers that I had. That's me on the left. And we often played with these students and just had a lot of fun. But I used to dialogue with these students all the time, and eventually I became a member of the family. And here's what I looked like when I finally adopted living in Yemen. It was an amazing experience. I loved it. It was fascinating. And I was still looking for words of wisdom here. Since it was purely a Muslim country, I used to go and pray in the mosque every day. And what fascinated me was I used to study Rumi, and he was a mystic among the Islamic community. And I found a lot of wisdom there. And one of the things I learned from Rumi was in humanity's desire to understand why they're on this earth and what's going on and what's important to them, Rumi said, I looked in temples, churches, and mosques, but I found the divine within my heart. And it was a wonderful expression of looking inside rather than externally for some sort of purpose and meaning in life. So after my year of teaching there, and I realized my Arabic language skills are not that good, I asked to study Arabic again for another year, and this time I went to Beirut, Lebanon. I went to Beirut because I was studying at St. Joseph University, and I was studying my second year of Arabic language. What a fascinating place this was. You had the beautiful mountains of Lebanon on the west, and then you had the Mediterranean Sea bordering it on the east. It was spectacular. You had beautiful Parisian-looking streets that were so pristine and beautifully designed. People were sitting around enjoying themselves in life. And then at the same time, you walk a block away and you'd have these bombed out buildings that reminded you of the violence that was still going on in Lebanon. Now, I lived in several places in Beirut because of the bombing, and we would move around a little bit depending on where the safest area of the city was. One of the places I ended up was in a school where it was empty because all the schools were closed, but it was a place where there were a group of Catholic nuns who were there, and they knew how to live within a bombing situation, which was brand new to me. So here are some of the scenes that I saw on a very regular basis while I was living in that school. Here you can see a mortar shell blew out the fence that was protecting the building that we were living in. There were always tanks in the area because they used our parking lot as a way to hide. Soldiers were always on guard of the area, or they were loading their weapons because they had just finished some type of fighting. and occasionally mortar shells would hit the building itself and blow out a bedroom. Because there was a lot of fighting going on and the school was closed, I decided that I would try to help refugees. So we would go to these very difficult places that had been bombed out, and we would try to help these people pull their life back together. Now, my experience of the shootings and bombings that I had to endure while I was there was really the beginning of how TRE started. There were two experiences that I had that were very common there. One, of course, if we would hear shooting starting or we'd hear a mortar shell going overhead, we would all duck like this. But there was one time when I was standing with a group of guys. We were standing around a car out in the street. It was safe. But then all of a sudden, a mortar shell came out of nowhere, and everybody ducked at the same time. And it fascinated me because we all did it together. It was as though it was choreographed. All of us did it at the same time. That was the beginning of me asking, how does our brain do something to the body, a specific muscle pattern actually, and make the body pull into a fetal position just like that? That fascinated me. I didn't understand it at the time, but it was the first time I actually saw it as something amazing that the brain and the body can actually do to help us survive life. The second one was that many times before, during, or after these experiences of shootings and bombings, we would find ourselves shaking. Now, like most people, we would laugh about it, tell ourselves to calm down, it was okay, it will go away in a minute. But I saw the shaking and I experienced it within inside myself, but still had no explanation. So I had no explanation for the fetal response that could happen so quickly or the tremoring response that would happen after that. And it just stuck in the back of my mind more as a curiosity of my human experience rather than something I was going to pursue. Now, another amazing opportunity that kind of just happened to me is I was invited to go meet Yasser Arafat. And I thought this would be fascinating because I wanted to understand what was he like as a human being, what was the Palestinian cause, and what drives people to be leaders, whether we like them or not. And I was curious just to meet him. Surprisingly enough, what I found out was he was a very kind man, actually, a very thoughtful and a very reflective man. So now that changes my whole mind again about how do we as human beings live on this planet? How do we judge people as good people or bad people? Or does, in fact, all people have qualities of good and bad inside of them? And it's a matter of finding those qualities in these human beings. So when I asked him about what the fighting was about, told him that I didn't understand it at its depth, and he said, well, people claim that the fighting is about religion, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, etc. And then he said something really interesting. All religious wars are about people arguing over who has the biggest invisible friend. So that was my experiences of living in that war situation for a year. And while I was there, I was reading some Lebanese authors. One of them was Khalil Gibran, because he was sort of a poet in Lebanon. And one of the things that I read that struck me was the smallest act of kindness is worth more than the greatest intention. And with that, I walked along the beaches of Lebanon and found myself going back to the United States.